9 o'clock this morning, an explosion occurred at the Alfred Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. The building was just simply cut away by this huge explosion.
Breaking news, 65 adults, 12 kids. The injuries are ranging from fair to critical right now.
The word that just stuck in my mind was layers. You know, I'm a local parish clergy, and that's kind of one layer of being exposed to the traumatic events of others. And then as a disaster responder, now I put myself in a situation where every human being I talked with was a survivor. And my world just got skewed. You know, I started to see the whole world as survivors with traumatic stories and evacuating and shelters and being stuck on the highway. And I looked at everybody and everything with that lens.
I have been involved with disaster recovery since 2011 when Springfield, Massachusetts had a tornado. It gets really, really stressful at times. During the course of this time, my dad died, so on top of dealing with other people's issues, I had my own issues and really have a place to go because everybody I knew was involved in their own disasters or their own issues. I found myself at a point where I just couldn't take any more.
And I started to realize that during those times, as I look back now, it wasn't that I just was tired, or it wasn't that I just was grouchy or suspicious or unhealthy. It was the times in which I lost the ability, the desire to try to fully function as a fruitful human being.
I heard about 15 to 20 gunshots. I just saw people running, everyone screaming. I just seen a bunch of people leaving on stretchers and life flights flying out of here at the moment.
We're bringing in grief counselors and people to talk to.
The early 1990s, there began to be a proliferation of scientific and popular literature that looked at the effects of caregiving upon the caregiver. And in that literature, we started seeing that people who bore witness to suffering, to trauma, to pain, that there was a collection of symptoms that impacted the caregiver almost as badly as the survivor.
Like most professional caregivers, a high level of demand on myself for excellence. And I kept thinking I could master the hurricane. If I just worked faster and harder and more intensely and longer, it would all, I'd be able to control it. And failing at that, which of course inevitably I did, it began to cause me to feel disappointed in myself. It caused me to turn on people that I loved.
By 1995, there were 3 books that were published, and one of those books was by Charles Figley, called Compassion Fatigue, and that was really the advent of this concept of compassion fatigue making its way into popular culture. It's the negative effects associated with helping. What's kind of emerged since then is that there's 2 real consistent ways that people end up with symptoms associated with caregiving, and compassion fatigue is comprised of, on one hand, secondary traumatic stress, and on the other hand, burnout. And the secondary traumatic stress concerns itself with more the impact of bearing witness to those stories, where the burnout is more around the environmental demands, effects of our workplace upon us.
I spent 3 months as a disaster responder. All those layers just piled up, and the way that it hit me was physiologically. I came back from that deployment and discovered through a series of events that for the first time in my life I had chronic high blood pressure. Never had a problem with it before.
You're collecting as the caregiver, as the lead storyteller, if you're a preacher in a community, you're collecting those narratives, and they're sitting on you and sitting on you, and every time you kind of try to swim to the surface to listen and to see where the goodness in life is, it's like somebody dumps another load of cloudiness on you.
Well, it's really hard to hear those stories. Sometimes they are in some shelters, in some place, and they come to visit us, or they are living with family. And it's really hard when all the shelters are also full and they don't have where to go. I see family living in a car because they don't know where it's going to live. I start transferring all those experiences for those people into my own life. What it really bothered me is I am a social worker. I had a master's degree in social work. I know what I'm doing. It's never happened to me before. It's never occurred to me that it could happen to me, but it did.
If I'm not careful, I just see the world as a very dangerous place where there's a tornado around every corner, where there's a gas line just waiting to blow up. The world is just not a place of grace and love and peace, but it's a place where just lots of bad stuff happens.
We have indicated here a very strong tornado vortex signature.
I think it's right in the Tuscaloosa area.
Yeah, it looks very serious.
Very dangerous situation. Look at that. Folks, this is a violent tornado.
I notice the impacts of compassion fatigue with colleagues as I work with them. Just a simple loss of humor and taking oneself way too seriously. But that's the only way they know how for it to come out.
The way that burnout affects a caregiver is it's more of a kind of closing down, that it's a fatigue response. Secondary traumatic stress is more of an anxiety disorder or anxiety effect, where the burnout is more of a depression. And what happens is that the two of those come together and affect the person simultaneously, producing a state that we've called compassion fatigue.
I began to get kind of snarky and mean-spirited, and sort of, I think, cloaked my sense of anxiety and fearfulness about being able to be successful in the recovery and how the congregation would go forward afterwards and whether we'd be able to be resilient and healthy. Cloaked all that anxiety in sort of a mean-spiritedness and a distancing of people.
Hearing a hideous story about a shooting that was an intentional choice. 6, 7 people were murdered. And it was told by a young woman who survived, who saw it from under her desk. So hearing her story, her narrative, her pain, kind of found its way into my being. And it did more than startle me. It got into me.
If you get a splinter, and if you leave the splinter buried, it may be a nuisance, but eventually it's going to start getting infected, and it's going to start to fester, and it literally makes the whole body ill.
The end result of that was alienation from the people I loved, and alienation from myself, because I ceased feeling competent and happy with the person I was, and joyful in my ministry. It took a long time to become joyful in ministry again.
And the quicker you can remove that, albeit a little bit of pain in the beginning, then the body has this incredible capacity for resilience and to heal itself. And now I'm getting better at it. I haven't reached it yet, but I'm getting better at saying, it's there, it's going to stay there, and it's only going to get worse. So let's get rid of it now. And let's remember it as a part of my life, but let it not take over my life.
My morale has been up and down ever since. One day I'll feel like, oh, well, it's an opportunity for a new life. The next day I'll think, oh, everything I love is gone. And somebody told me, he said, well, it's not the end of the world. And I thought, well, it's the end of my world.
The energy with which people rush into the breach in the first moments can be very positive, but there's also a lot of sort of heroic over-functioning that people sometimes experience as very aggressive and controlling, and that creates resistance in other people. And there are parts of the population that are more directly affected and impacted and fragile. It's definitely a very toxic environment.
Somebody once described it to me this way: if you're going to go into the hospital, visit people, I'm putting myself in an environment that has some very serious bugs in there that are communicable. And I can either choose not to go and visit in the hospital, which is against my mission, or I can stay healthy, not have my immune system compromised, and I can go in there on a daily basis. And I make that same analogy to a disaster environment.
Sometimes people think that the opportunity to go into a disaster and help people is a really fabulous and exciting thing. And sometimes people say, you know, but what's that like going into a disaster? And is it scary when you're there after a fire or after a shooting? And
when I first started out in disaster response, I was there to fix a problem. And my whole sense of the success of the deployment was scored in terms of how successful I was. You know, did I find a contractor for this person? Did we find the person who can come in and be the long-term disaster coordinator? And that put a lot of pressure on me. And I think I added to the toxic environment, because now I brought my own agenda, and I brought my own anxiety, and I brought my own toxicity to the environment.
And I think for people of faith, the level of questioning of how God is, or is God present, put a whole additional layer of fearfulness. Because it's one thing to be in the valley of the shadow, if you think He is with you or God is with you. But if you're in the valley of the shadow and you don't think God has shown up to walk alongside you, that's a whole additional layer of terror and worldview shattering that's almost paralyzing.
You know, certainly you see the best in human nature, but you also see the flip side of that. You see what can be the worst of human nature, the conflict, the arguing, the kingdom building, the inability to work together are all there. And by definition, a disaster overwhelms local coping mechanisms. Everybody in a caregiving role is putting themselves in a toxic environment because you're exposing yourself to the trauma of others. Why do I do it? And should I do it? I can do it in a sustainable way and do it pretty well. When I can function as highly as I can, I'm going to have the most to offer. And I'm going to be the conduit for the grace of God in the most effective way. It feels good. That's the reason I'm here. It feels like I've made a difference.
At the very core, it is the expression of caring for another in the place that they are, with the embodiment of acceptance rather than judgment, help rather than hurt.
To be in a ministry of presence in those initial moments or in those initial weeks and months is to be able to hold someone's hand while they are in the valley of death, in the valley of the shadow, and to say, I'll stand with you here, I'll be your companion here while you do this work. Resurrection doesn't come unless you're willing to enter into that world of loss and terror.
If you're willing to walk beside somebody and enter into their life, you know, not walking in front of them to lead or behind them to push, but walking beside them to accompany and to help people gain a perspective, just to give them the opportunity to have that sanctuary, that safe space where they can bring those to the surface, those next steps, those skills, that knowledge.
What I need is to understand that I'm entering a place where people are in pain and they're frightened, and mostly what they need from me is to be present and to show up and walk alongside them.
If we allow people to continue to think in terms of resources versus demands, the equation's always going to be overwhelming. And I think part of what we can offer as a disaster responder is to intervene in that cycle. If we can come in and try to dampen that and to be able to act according to intention in the midst of an overwhelming environment, we can bring about the best work.
I discovered pretty soon that the environment isn't toxic. It's my response that's toxic. That the external experience doesn't have to determine my internal response. So what's toxic is how I choose to respond to bad stuff. And in learning how to relax my muscles and live within intentionality, live within my mission, I'm able to deal with the pain and sadness and the yuck of life without it impacting me in such a negative, hurtful way.
Is the level of toxicity in the environment is the same, but I'm different. I'm resilient. I have been inoculated, if you will, by the antibodies I try to teach and practice, and so I can choose to enter with a system that's still sick, still suffering, still toxic, and choose how I'm going to respond in that setting. If I were to give advice to a beginning disaster responder, I would say trust yourself and care for yourself. You have what you need to show up and grace people who are in crisis.
I just kind of, walk into situations now with the sense of that I'm not going to live by fear. I'm going to live by faith. With a very clear understanding of who I am and what I'm called to do and to be, it's a very good gift to give to yourself the ability to say you cannot be everything to all people. You can be the best you are within the mission that you live.
As I practice these skills, I've learned that they're not just pigeonholed for one area. It's not like I take them out of the closet when I go on a disaster and then I put them away when I get home, but I keep them 24/7. It's amazing the relationships that are born under those circumstances, and some of my best friends have been people I've met as we have shared that disaster. They as somebody who was impacted and me as a responder.
I'm a better pastor, I'm a better parent, I'm a better husband, I'm a better friend. I mean, that's really the most wonderful gift that I can give myself, is to stay on mission.
Every day, I'm happy to get up and go to work. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be who I am and to do what I do, and to know that no matter where I'm called out to respond as a disaster responder, that I can do that with a grateful heart, and that I'll have the resources I need to do it adequately and well. That makes it a privilege, but more than that, a sustaining kind of long-term joy that I know will last really all of my life.